Okay, hi everybody. Hello and welcome to the IDPro Skills Survey Q&A. Thanks so much for joining us. So today we have IDPro founders Ian Glazer and Andy Hindle hosting a Q&A session to discuss the results of the 2022 IDPro Skills Programs and Diversity Survey. So before we get started, we do have a few housekeeping items. So please stay on mute throughout the session and make sure to disable video. If you have questions, please type them into the chat and we'll answer at the end. And as always, please be respectful. And now I will hand it over to Ian to get things started.
Thank you so much. Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us, no matter where you are in the world. Andy and I are thrilled to be able to join you today and talk about the skills survey. This is something that Andy and I have been doing for the last 5 years. It's always been a thrill to see the results and compare them year over year. So I just really want to extend my thank you for joining us today. And if you're listening into the recording, thanks for tuning in later. Andy, what do you think?
Yeah, that was a wonderful introduction. Thank you, Ian. Just for everyone's benefit, in case they don't know who you are, do you want to just kind of tell them and then we'll pick up from there?
That's fair. So I'm Ian Glazer. I am one of the co-founders of IDPro and been working on working in the identity space for over many years. That number will stay undefined for personal reasons. And my day job is I look after identity product management at Salesforce.
And I'm Andy Hindle. I've been involved with IDPro since its inception. I've been on the board for a while. I was chair of the board last year. My day job is not dissimilar in that I consult generally in the identity space, but most of that time is taken up looking after Identiverse and managing the content committee and various other things there. So that's me. And let me just take you through a little bit of what we're planning to cover during the course of the rest of this broadcast, webinar, audio thing. So we'll talk a little bit. Ian, do you have an opinion on that? Or
Yeah, I don't know what to call this thing. It's just the Andy and Ian hour. It's good.
Here it is. Perfect. It occurs to me that Ian and I have done this once before, although we did it in person. And I want to say it was on Identiverse in DC or Boston. Was that right?
I think we came down to it was Boston.
It was Boston. Yeah, that's right. So yeah, it's fun to do it again and in a different format, which is nice. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk a little bit about IDPro, just for anyone that's joining us that kind of isn't familiar with the organization, what we've been doing over the last 5 years or so. We'll give a brief introduction to the survey, its reason for being, how we operate it, and you know what we do with it, those kinds of things. Then we'll get into the meat of it a little bit, and we'll talk through some of the primary things that we feel like we learned out of this year. And we'll pull out a handful of takeaways. We'll make sure at the end there's a link. So for those of you that haven't downloaded the full report, you're welcome to go and do that. And if we're any good at time management at all, then we should have some time for a handful of questions at the end, which we will do our best to answer in a useful fashion. And with that, let me hand it across to Ian, and he can talk a little bit about the organization that he co-founded, IDPro.
So IDPro has been around for quite some time now, and the origin story is simply we needed a way to professionalize the industry. And so IDPro's mission is really to instill and progress the industry and practitioners and their practice thereof of identity management. This is so that not only we can build more practitioners because we need more, but also provides a way for peers to give back to one another and to the community that they so very much love. The organization provides not only that kind of community that is really driven to give back to one another. So a very active Slack workspace where people can ask all manner of questions. I think There's one that came in today about MFA recovery scenarios, which is a bit of a headbender, and I need to think a little bit more about it. But people being able to help one another solve problems they have. IDPro also has a body of knowledge. These are vendor-neutral learning materials. And this is really important because in the early days, pre-IDPro, as we were starting to formulate the organization, there was a clear need from people that certainly I were talking to around the world that said, one of the things that would really help me as a practitioner come up to speed faster, better understand the space we work in is vendor-neutral materials. And so our body of knowledge is just that. We have dozens of articles ranging from authentication, single sign-on, PKI. These are all really powerful learning materials that are freely available to individuals and can be used for learning purposes inside of organizations. We're really pleased about that. And on top of that, we offer the CIDPro, Certified Identity Practitioner certification. And the CIDPro is really the first of its kind. It is a certification written for someone who has been working in the industry for about 2 years. So if you've been working in identity management for around 2 years, you should be able to pass the certification. And it's really meant to have, as I keep saying, have teeth, really demonstrate that you've achieved something, you understand the sort of identity arts, if you will. And you'll see people on LinkedIn advertising their CIDPro badge. It's something that people who get it are really proud of. And it's a real value add for organizations to find talent who've already gotten their CIDPro. So a real boon to the industry as we try to professionalize it. Andy, you want to set the stage a little bit for the survey itself?
I would be happy to do so. And so, yeah, Ian describes the genesis of the organization and some of what we've kind of learned to do and started to do over the course of the last 5 years. In the very early days when we started out, we had some hypotheses about, what shape the industry was, what professionals were going to need, what enterprises were likely to be looking to do with, identity solutions in the identity space. And they were hypotheses, right? They were reasonably well informed, but we felt like there was value not only to us, but also to our members and frankly to the wider industry in starting a process of gathering some data to back that up, to really get a picture of, from the professional identity practitioner's perspective, what does this industry look like? And so we started the survey really with those things in mind, right? To try and understand the world of the identity professional and have that supported with some data. So what we'll go through today is the fifth installment of this epic that we are writing. The first 2 years that we did it, we actually did a combined survey across, I want to say 2018 and 2019. And then last year, we added to it a set of inclusivity and diversity questions to start to understand that side of the industry, both from the practitioner perspective, but also from the employer perspective a little bit, understanding how organizations are dealing with some of those questions. So it really, as a piece of work, it really sets out to inform the industry as a whole about practitioners, about their interests. It looks at skills requirements. It looks at the length of time it takes for individuals to feel comfortable they have indeed acquired those skills. And one of the values that we're starting to get now that we've been doing it for 5 years is that we've got data going back over that period of time. And so we're slowly starting to unpick some trends and some things that are changing, things that are staying the same over that sort of longitudinal set of data. I think probably the only other thing to say about it is that, as with all of the activities that we carry out at IDPro, this only happens because of all the wonderful members that support us, both individuals and organizations. And so, their help is obviously crucial in putting something like this together. So with that, I'm going to hand it across to Ian. And Ian, do you want to talk a little bit about some of the top level things that we've learned?
Absolutely. So this year, one of the things that we observe is what we're calling the COVID spring, that organizations and individuals emerged from the pandemic, changed. And that meant changes in priority, it meant changes in interest, it meant changes in the skills that we found useful. This year, the changes really that we saw were at the priorities for the organization, first, most notably. MFA has been one of the top 3 responses we've seen for years. Through COVID, however, it has often been the number one control that has been of interest by organizations. And this shouldn't be a great surprise. We know that with workforces increasingly moving to some form of hybrid or full remote, that MFA as a security function was really valuable. And so we saw throughout the pandemic that that was being employed. This year, it's dropped from number 1 to number 2. I don't think there is necessarily a lack of interest in MFA. It's more that now organizations are coming back and saying, wow, okay, we now know how to do a hybrid workforce. We now know how to do more remote work. And so then what else do we need to be focused on? So what you see here is our respondents identifying, saying, we believe that the organizations that we work for, these are their interests, right? So this was not necessarily a question we asked to organizations as a whole. What we did was we asked practitioners, what are the organizations you're related with interested in? This year, IGA is the top vote. And the hypothesis goes like this, that organizations through the pandemic put on hold some of their compliance and access governance activities and started focusing on 2 things. One, a bit of how do we get more agility in our identity layer? Essentially, how do we manage, some of the challenges that a remote workforce puts on us, MFA being one of them. We did see an increased interest in IDaaS, for example. And the third thing was CIAM, was customer identity. People realized very quickly that the brick and mortar way of interacting with people needed a digital twin. And so through the pandemic, we saw a lot of activity there. This year, what I think we're seeing is organizations saying, I think we've done enough in CIAM. It's not the top priority anymore. We've got to get back on governance. We've got to get back on compliance. And thus, we're starting to see IGA as sort of the top choice and IDaaS as number 3. So the way we're seeing this is the COVID spring from an organizational perspective means a return to more, let's call them traditional identity controls and functions that needed to be deployed. And I think the other part of that, or included within that, is a desire, inconsistent desire around IDaaS and using the cloud as an identity service provider, as opposed to maybe more traditional on-premises deployments. The good news in this, when we look at these responses about what organizations are interested in on the next slide, is our practitioners have experiences in all of the areas that enterprise seems to be interested in. So we ask the people that are taking the surveys, where do you have previous experience, or where are you currently working? And as 8 you see here, really the top 5 have been very, very consistent. It is reasonably safe to say that if you bumped into an identity practitioner at a happy hour, they're going to say, I have experience either doing MFA, federation, or provisioning, maybe RBAC, maybe role-based. And then there's sort of, and then depending, we'll see things like directory, see things like IGA. So the existing workforce, I think it's safe to say, has experiences in many of the areas that enterprises are interested in. Now, in a minute, we're going to talk about where practitioners are interested in learning. Hey, it's great that a majority of us have MFA experience or federation experience. But there's another side of it, which is like, well, we may have experience in those areas. Where don't necessarily we have experiences? Where do we want to learn? And that's going to come up in a second when we talk about how enterprise and individual interests are aligned, or maybe not so much so. Andy, so we've talked a little bit about places where we have experience and interest from an enterprise perspective in terms of the identity disciplines and identity functions, but you want to tell the audience a little bit about some of the skills that practitioners use sort of to be successful in these endeavors?
Yeah, I'd love to do that. And this is one of the things that for me is particularly interesting about this industry more than any of the other bits of the software industry that I happen to have dipped in over the course of my career. That we see a broad set of skills being required to be really, really successful in this particular industry. And as you talk to people who've, kind of grown up through their careers in the industry, you learn some really interesting things about people's backgrounds as well. Lots of folks who don't come from a traditional kind of computer sciences background, but lots of folks who've got fascinating degrees in things like the classics or languages or that kind of thing. So yeah, on the next slide, we look a little bit at some of the top technical skills, but also the top non-technical skills that practitioners feel have served them well in their careers. So again, a lot of consistency year over year. The top three technical skills are, not particularly surprising and have been fairly consistent over the last few years. On the non-technical side, lateral thinking, unsurprisingly, has been top of that list. I think, Ian, I'm right in saying since the beginning. I'm doing that from memory, but I'm pretty sure that that's true.
I am pretty sure that system architecture and lateral thinking have been the #1 technical and non-technical skills. You're right. I think since the beginning, which if anyone spent any time in this industry, doesn't feel super surprising, because you walk in and it's like, okay, here's a bag of piece parts. Here's a business objective. Best of luck. Figure out how you're going to do it. Certainly a lot of practitioners will feel like, oh yes, that's the world I live in.
Indeed. And in fact, you talked about the Slack channel earlier on, and I have a lot of fun reading those posts that say things like, hey, I'm on site and I'm trying to integrate product X with product Y. The two vendors tell me I should be able to do this, but it doesn't work. Has anyone done it? And 5 minutes later, you get somebody saying, yeah, no, I've done this before. Exactly that point, right? So those have been pretty consistent. The one that really stood out for me this year is on the non-technical side, the business awareness thing, right? So significant increase like that bubbled up from way down the bottom of the list to in the top 3 in the space of 12 months. And, there are lots of different ways to interpret that as a single data point. My preferred interpretation is I think that it suggests that the business is now starting to understand the deep value that identity brings right across the organization, right? We know that in most organizations, it tends to sort of stick in somewhere in the security infrastructure group somewhere, right? There are exceptions to that, but generally speaking, that's where we tend to find, this bit of the industry. And I think that that's starting to change. And I'm optimistic that sudden need for business awareness is an early indicator that that's starting to change. The other thing that was notable this year is the rise of empathy as one of the non-technical skills that we see reported. And so on the next slide, you'll see that that increased significantly as a response in this year's survey. Again, lots of ways to interpret the single data point, but we wonder whether, is that an effect of the COVID situation, the rise of remote working, the need to be a little bit more sensitive and understanding and interpret what people are saying when you aren't necessarily able to sit with them face to face. Who knows? But it'll be interesting to see if that sort of sticks as we go into next year and the year after, or whether it drops back again. I think it's a very positive development, but like I say, it'll be interesting to see if it hangs around or if it goes away.
Andy, on that point, it's not just the sort of need because of necessarily the pandemic itself, but I actually think that the move towards hybrid and remote work really pushes the need for empathy, because now more so than ever, it's a lot more written word, and tone tends to get lost in written word. And a good practice is really to maybe just tap the brakes before reading too much into someone's text, into someone's Slack message, having a breath and then saying, okay, what's going on? What's really being communicated? And that's really powerful. And let's be clear, gang, this has nothing to do with identity management, right? This is about how we be successful professionals, regardless of the practice.
Yeah, absolutely.
So let's go to the next slide and talk about another thing that we observed in the survey data this year. So COVID spring was about sort of enterprise and practitioners waking up and saying, okay, wow, the last couple of years were pretty crazy. What do we want to do now? Where do we need to go? But the rise of applied identity is something that honestly took Andy and I a little bit by surprise. So on the next slide, we ask, where do people have experience? Now, you saw some of this previously, where MFA, federation, provisioning tend to be the top three. But what we saw and what we've seen actually over the last couple of surveys, it was there in the data, but we didn't recognize it, is that we think we're seeing an emergence of different kinds of identity practitioners. There are those who operate our identity machinery. I look after the IGA service and the federation service for my enterprise. And I think many of us, certainly I recognize some of the names on the call today, and I think I'll say, like, yeah, that's me, that's what I do. But we're seeing, and have actually seen over a while, another kind of practitioner who is taking identity technology and applying it in different disciplines, whether it's in mobile, whether it's for privacy, whether it's for connected devices. So we think, and we do need to let this play out over a little bit more time, but what we're starting to see, and I think this is incredibly exciting, is that there are practitioners who say, I don't turn the wrenches on our directory infrastructure. What I do is I take, authoritative identity data and I mix it with some of our authentication capabilities, and I apply it for our connected device solution, let's say. And that practitioner looking after the applied identity, if you will, is really neat. And it should be of no surprise to anyone that we see this. What is exciting, and I think what maybe is the thing that I'm hopeful for, is that we see this grow, that the people that are applying identity technology as an identity practitioner sort of recognize, yeah, we do things a little bit differently. But there's another thing I'm hopeful for, which is I believe there are a lot of people in organizations who are applying identity technology and have no idea necessarily they're doing identity, if we were to put that in air quotes. And I think one of the things that as practitioners, certainly in larger organizations, our opportunity to build increased business value is find those people who are applying our technologies, our capabilities for a business outcome. Because if you can find them and you can help them, what you're doing is directly contributing to business value. And that's regardless of the mission, public sector, private sector, doesn't matter. So I think there's a lot of promise in this notion of applied identity. Andy and I haven't talked too much about this outside of writing the report, but Andy, I don't know if you want to add a little to this, because this is certainly a place that I'm very interested in seeing how it grows.
Yeah, so very much to I'm totally with you on this one, Ian. Very much to the point I made a few minutes ago, right? I think the business is starting slowly to understand that there are a bunch of places that identity writ large impact on the business. And that's where we're starting to see these applications come up. I also wanted to pick up, there's a subtlety in the way that we have these responses structured, which is that some of you may have noticed, we've got two distinct lines, one for verifiable credentials and one for decentralized and self-sovereign, right? So we can, not now, but I'm happy to get into a conversation, I'm sure with Ian as well, about why we have those on distinct lines. However, there's a reasonable case to be made that if you lump them together into a kind of, personal identity application, that ends up, right at the top of this list, which is really interesting. And then with privacy right below it, again, you can interpret these things in different ways, but I do think it's an interesting early indicator. We talked earlier on about the reasonable correlation, the reasonable match between skills that practitioners report having and the areas that the enterprises that they work in, that those practitioners report being a focus for the next 18 to 24 to 36 months. One of the interesting other questions that we ask in the survey, and we'll look at this on the next slide, is so what are the priorities that you have as an individual practitioner over the next 18 months? So there's some fascinating correlation between the areas that get answered here and the results that we just saw on the previous slide, right? So you'll notice that, privacy related pops up here, decentralized pops up here. There's standards development has always appeared in this list at some level or another, but there's a reasonable mix across the top results here of what Ian and I are at the moment choosing to call these applied areas, and then the mechanics that sort of underlie it. We've seen over a number of years that these answers tend to point to, not necessarily directly, but give a reasonable sense of where things are likely to be going for enterprises, for the industry over the course of the next N years. It's not 100% correlation, you wouldn't expect it to be, but it does give a reasonable sense. And the other thing that you start to get a sense of, and we'll see this a little bit on the next graph, is there's a mismatch between what individuals report that they are going to be interested in. In other words, the things that they think are going to matter over the next 18 months versus what the enterprise tells them the enterprise is going to be interested in. And now that we're starting to get, 5 years of data, and next year it'll be 6 years, we can start slowly to look back over those results over time and see how accurate that correlation is. But certainly as you look on the next graph at the results from this year, you can see that whilst there is some match here, right? You can see IDAS, for example, coming up pretty strongly on both sides of this, organizational priorities relative to individual priorities. There are some reasonable differences here as well. And we've said for a number of years, we've seen this mismatch. Some years it's bigger than others, but we call it out pretty much every year. And I think there's two possible interpretations, right? One is that the enterprise is maybe not doing a great job of communicating what its real priorities are to the individual, right? That's a possibility. Because again, remember that these organizational priorities are what the practitioner is reporting. But the other thing is, it's possible that the enterprise actually needs to listen more to the practitioner and say, okay, look, there are some things happening in the industry. We need to understand that better. How do we, incorporate that into our business? And hopefully this increase of sort of business awareness is going to help us a little bit.
There's another thing that happens here, which is that we also see, now we not only see a feedback loop where the individual is sort of nudging the organization towards what's new, but we also see the other way in which when organizations are expressing their priorities, we are seeing individual response. IDAS is an example of that. And I think it's quite simply a response to the market and to the employment market. People, if enterprises consistently looked at IDaaS or SIAM, it shouldn't be a surprise that we see practitioners saying, heck, I maybe need to get stronger skills in those kinds of areas because maybe I haven't traditionally worked with them. So there's a very interesting feedback loop that I think we have enough data to see and, want to see how it changes in the future.
Yeah. So I think we should change gears a little bit, Ian, and maybe talk about the inclusivity and diversity stuff that we added. So this will be the second year of that. Do you want to pick that up?
So this is the second year that we have included questions about diversity and inclusivity. And we include there also questions about self-identification, gender identity, sexual identity, et cetera. Predominantly, respondents are heterosexual, Caucasian, white male. This year, however, we saw more respondents than ever choosing something other than that. And I think that's important and heartening. People are being more comfortable talking about who they are in surveys like this. But to go back to Andy's point about business awareness, diversity is important in every industry. However, that is true especially so. Having a diverse teams working on identity programs and problems is truly crucial. And don't take my word for that. Go check out our good friends over at Women in Identity and the work they did on the human impact of identity exclusion. It's some really great research that talks about the challenges that an organization may unintentionally present to people that are differently able, that are not necessarily heterosexual white male, in terms of the technologies and solutions that they build. Women in Identity have been doing some great work here in both code of conduct and this study on identity exclusion. So do take the time and check it out. And that's part of the reason why we want to include these kinds of questions going forward, is to give people better windows into the state of the industry. So on the next slide, we ask about the respondents' view of their organization. Is the organization that they're most affiliated with dedicated to diversity and inclusion? And we have a majority response say either agree or strongly agree. Now, it's important to note that respondents, we have not necessarily a majority, but a very healthy portion of respondents come from larger organizations. And an interpretation of this is larger organizations have the resources, the willingness, and even sometimes the stakeholder push to invest in diversity, invest in inclusion. So it is one thing to consider is the respondents themselves. And if you look at the report, you can see the breakdown of industry and employer size and draw some of your own conclusions about, well, maybe larger organizations are putting more resource behind this. On the next slide, we also ask a sense of whether the organization is building a diverse workforce. Are they hiring from diverse workforce? And this is the obviously overwhelming majority saying either agree or strongly agree. And this is great because, as I mentioned, as Women in Identity have looked at, having more diverse identity teams specifically leads to better outcomes. On the next slide, we ask about diversity as an individual priority. And it's great to see that it ranks up there. It may not be the top, but for a majority of respondents, it is important. So it may not be the most important, but it's up there. And that's great. That's heartening to see that the teams that handle so much sensitive information potentially, that can build technologies that can be unintentionally exclusive, that people are thinking about diversity, and that's really important for us. And on the next slide, Mandy, you want to talk about some of the takeaways that we've been writing about and talking about over the last few months as we've been sorting through the data?
I would love to. Yeah, just briefly on the inclusivity thing, and Ian and I have gone back and forth about, is it inclusivity or inclusiveness? We're still not sure. So,
We're trying.
but yeah, I just want to echo the point that Ian makes. Right, these are important things, irrespective of what industry you're in, what sector you happen to operate in. But there is a particular import from an identity perspective, and so the fact that we're starting to gather this information and working with other organizations in the sector to understand this a little bit better, to promote it, to help people understand it a little bit better. It'll be really interesting to see how that whole area develops over the coming few years. So in the survey, if you download it and read it, you'll see that we pull out some really high level kind of takeaways right up top, in the hope that that gets onto an executive desk somewhere and helps them make some smart decisions about what they're going to do in this space. So I'll pull a couple of those out, and then I think we're going to be just about at the right time to take a few questions at the end as well. So three things. The first one really is around the individual practitioner. And so we talked a little bit about the different skills that we see people both exhibiting and choosing or intending to acquire. It's a broad set of skills. It's not just technical skills. And the reality is that this is one of the most active, vibrant learning environments for professionals that frankly, and again, I've worked in a number of different industries. This one's tough. We didn't talk about it, but every year we ask a question about how long did it take you to feel proficient as an identity professional, not be, but feel. And there's a really interesting link between the people who've been in the industry for a long time who say, yeah, I still don't feel proficient. And we've talked to a few of those folks, and overwhelmingly the reaction we get is,
we are a few of those folks. Let's be real about this. Like, our board has members of it who absolutely have been in this industry for more than 10, more than 15 years, and respond, just because we ask them, with not necessarily feeling proficient. And I'm one of them, and I think it's a great thing.
Yep. Absolutely. But it does speak, I think, to, there's a lot of change, there's a lot to learn. And so for the individual practitioner looking at this, some of the takeaways that Ian had earlier on about, look at where people are focusing, consider whether those are skills areas that you need to acquire, both on the technical and the non-technical side. And be alert to those, opportunities for continual learning, because, they're always coming up. Managers and leaders of teams need to continue to focus on the inclusivity, the inclusiveness practices, not only in terms of building highly functional teams, but also in terms of the need for the solutions that they're deploying to work for everybody and to work well for everybody. So that will continue to be important. I expect it will get more important over time. And it's definitely an area for those folks to look at. From an executive perspective, we talked a little bit about this, kind of mismatch between what we know is happening in the industry and the areas that enterprises are interested in. My sense, and Ian and I have been saying this for a long time, and we are slowly starting to see some change, right? It's about time that identity got properly represented, at least at the senior executive level, if not in the boardroom. And we're starting to see some early signs of that. I know lots of us will keep, pushing for that. I think it will help us a lot if we can start to get that change to happen. Ian, is there anything that I missed in there?
No, I think you covered all the high notes. And I'll say that one of the things that, having done this now for 5 years, seeing some consistency and the change both in almost equal measure is really powerful, right? Seeing now that the application of identity and the business awareness of identity is really starting to grow, and more needed than ever, is a powerful thing. And it's one of the reasons why certainly I do what I do, is because I like to figure out ways to be of use, of service. And I think all of us do, especially people that are operating identity systems, right? We're trying to help enable a business outcome. And sometimes I was just talking to my teams yesterday at a town hall. Sometimes it's hard to draw a straight line from the thing we're working on to that outcome, that business mission. But we've got to take the time to remind ourselves of it because it is so important. The kinds of things we do are so important to industry, be it public sector, private sector, regardless of geography. Take that moment and maybe take that moment, read the report, think about ways to talk to the business better, find those practitioners, those appliers of technology, of identity technology, to partner with them, to become buds with them, have a coffee, get to know them, because by doing that, we'll be able to solve more of their problems.
I think we almost exactly hit our time mark there, Ian.
I was about to say, I think we hit our time mark, which means now is the opportunity to, back in my analyst days, we would call this Stump the Chump, where you would have an audience of people just sort of asking you questions of any sort at any order and field them. So if people that have joined us today have questions or are listening along and want to put them in Slack or the chat, please do. Really excited to answer them.
Hey everyone. So yeah, if you could please post your, feel free to post any questions you have in the chat and I'll go ahead and read them to our presenters. So the first question that we received is, how did you differentiate between practitioners and vendors? And how did you remove non-practitioners from the survey?
So it's a great question because it talks really to data quality and the methodology. So let me describe that in a little detail. So we used SurveyMonkey, have used SurveyMonkey over the years to conduct this survey. We distribute an invitation to the survey to both our membership and publicly through our own social networks. I do this as well as others do this amongst their own teams. So we did not actually separate out members from non-members. We didn't necessarily separate out practitioner from non-practitioner because we didn't actually ask some of those questions. What we instead asked was, what are the kinds of industries that you work in? So essentially, where are you coming from? So we can say, oh, look, this year we have a preponderance of people responding from high tech, for example. And we didn't explicitly say, are you a practitioner versus maybe someone who is building an identity technology? Because in my mind, that's all part of the same story. But you'll see in the early parts of the survey, we talk about the demographics. Essentially, how long have you been working with identity? Where are you coming from? What geography? What industry? Et cetera. We use that as a bit of a filter for understanding the data that we have.
Awesome. So the next question is, are there any plans to bring forth additional certifications? In parentheses, dev focused or like a level up?
So that's a really good question too, slightly broader than the survey, but I'll try and weave both of them together a little bit if I can. One of the things the survey told us early on, so if you go back to the first couple of years when we ran it, is that there was very clearly a need expressed by practitioners in the industry for vendor neutral training, particularly, and training materials, and for certification. That isn't, by the way, to say that the vendors don't do a really good job of providing training and providing technical learning materials. Many of them do provide excellent materials, but by definition, they tend to be focused on the area of that particular vendor's interest. So to some extent, that helped inform the development of the body of knowledge that IDPro has been building with the help of many volunteer practitioners around the world, and the CIDPro that Ian talked about earlier on. Again, the questions there written by identity practitioners on a global basis. We're starting to embed that into the consciousness, as it were, of the industry. And we're also starting to look, partly through the survey results that we get and partly through some of the other conversations that we have outside of that, at what other areas might be worthwhile for us to add. So, short answer, yes, it's absolutely something that IDPro is looking at. We don't have a time frame yet, but it seems likely that it would make sense for us to add additional capabilities, additional depth to the certification that we currently offer. And certainly we'll look to the survey to help inform, which areas should we prioritize relative to others. Yeah.
The next question is, what is meant by lateral thinking?
So inside,
I need to think about the best way to answer that one, Ian.
Okay, yeah, I'm gonna come up with something. So here's the thing. I mentioned we use SurveyMonkey to conduct these surveys. The questions are written by sort of Andy and I first wrote the questions, and then we keep reviewing them every year with the board. And one thing, as a someone who helped write questions for the IDPro certification, I learned very quickly it's really hard to write good questions. And those of you who are joining us who are also question writers from this from the certification, you will know that very particular thing. So when we have, it's not just the questions, it's also the answers that are actually super challenging. So for example, a change in this year's survey over last is that we have verified credentials as a separate answer to some of our questions versus decentralized and self-sovereign. Previously, we had sort of blockchain and other applications of identity and SSI, and it didn't give us the right granularity, if you will, to look into certain questions. So this is a long way around to say writing the sort of choices that people have in the survey is quite a challenge. I think, and I'm going to raise my hand and say, I think I was the one who wrote this question and those answers. And I think at the time I was probably coming from some training and had a head full of maybe corporate speak, and where lateral thinking as in, well, the straight ahead approach would be, let's, do this kind of thing. But maybe if we come around the edges, there's actually a better, more efficient way to solve the problem. So I'm going to go with, thinking about a solution to a problem that isn't necessarily the straightforward, obvious path. Maybe taking a bit of beginner's mind and saying, well, I've been doing this for quite some time, and reflexively, I would say, oh, this is the solution to the problem. But maybe that's actually not right. Maybe I should take a moment and think about, well, what if we came at it from a slightly different angle? That's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
I'm going to let that stand. I think that sounded great.
Cool. Were there any additional questions that anyone would like to put in chat before we move on to the next portion? Okay, Ian and Andy, I think I can hand it back to you.
Yeah. So I think we'll just wrap up. We've got a link here, and we may have a mechanism to circulate this to anyone that hasn't got it after the call. We might be able to send something out. If not, you can always go to the IDPro website, and there'll be a link there. The full report is available to download. You can actually go and get all of the previous years as well if you want them. And we'd encourage you, I think, to do that. Take a look. There's a lot more detail in there. We actually put in the specific responses to each of the questions, so you can scroll through and look at every single one and just kind of see, what there is in there. And then, have your own opinions about whether the interpretation that Ian and I came up with this particular year is one that you agree with or not. And yeah, I don't think there's a lot else to add from that point of view, other than to thank you all very, very much for attending today. Really appreciate the questions and the attention. And please look out for the next survey that will be coming up in the early part of 2023. That's assuming that Ian and I get around to reviewing the questions. but we will publicize it fairly widely. And obviously, the more responses we get, the broader the data set, the more representative and the more useful the answers will be. Hey, you'll be creating more work for Ian and I to do in our spare time. So there's that. Ian, anything else you wanted to add?
That sounded like a win. No, I just want to emphasize thank you to all of the people that filled out this survey over the years and for participating today. One thing that we haven't quite done yet this year, which we've done in prior, and we should do this, Annie, let's talk offline about it, is we also can make a subset of the data available as well. So if you're a data nerd, if you want to play around with this, if you want to look at some of this year over year, we'd love to talk to you about that, because Andy and I can spreadsheet, but it ends pretty quickly there. We make no aspirational statements about us being data scientists. So what we bring is a certain read, having worked in enterprise. But if you've got more interest to dig deeper, let us know. We really want to support that and get more out of these results, especially as we build up a library of responses year over year. And with that, thank you again, everyone, and hope to see all of you soon.
Yep. Thank you.
Thanks everybody for joining today. We do plan on making this recording available. And as mentioned, the survey and report is available on the website. Thank you.